Hey guys, welcome back. So this is not a Miata video. I want to do a review of Pour 15 paint, cover what I've learned, how to apply this stuff to get excellent results, or at least pretty damn good results. I've gone through about 4 cans of this stuff, and to be honest with you, I have not really gotten good results. The first 2 to 3 cans of using it was not very impressive, especially in the beginning. This seemed like the worst paint ever, and now, after really working with it for a long time, I think I finally figured out the best way to use this stuff. So I thought it was worth explaining. Okay, so here's what I did. I actually have a sample over here, the first part I painted. That's actually a coincidence. So here's the first one I did, this pipe, piece of chromoly. I was evaluating if I could use this on a roll cage. So I just brushed it on, and it looks pretty good on the camera. It's really not. If you get up close, there's paint runs, things like that. So what I did was I painted this on pretty thick, and when I put it on thick it looked good, but it left a lot of like brush marks and a bunch of paint runs. So then I went and sanded all the paint runs and put a second thick coat on it, and that's why you see more paint runs, because I put it on too thick the second time. But it is glossy. If you back up far enough, this looks pretty good, and it is a damn sure durable. Like, I can't really dig my fingernail into this. This is some hard paint, so I could tell there was promise, but it was not as easy to apply as I thought it was. And I took this metal and I sanded it and got it cleaner than you would ever believe. Took acetone, ran white rags and acetone over it, and really got all the oils out of it. I don't know, this paint just doesn't really lay down, and it likes to run. It seems like it's really runny paint, hard to get. It just doesn't seem like it's working right. Okay, turns out that's user error, but that's what it did. Now, I was making all kinds of mistakes. So another mistake I was making back then, I didn't mix the paint properly. Let me get into that. So this paint is full of solids. So what do I mean by that? So when you open the can of paint, they tell you to stir it. Well, stirring paint's pretty common. But what I've never seen is that when you go to stir paint, there's like this goop in the bottom, and it can be like a rock, or damn near like a rock. So you take your paint mixer, you pop the lid off, and you try to go in there and stir this, and you're just like hitting this goop in the bottom. And what I just did was, I don't know, that stuff wouldn't budge, so I just stirred the paint above it and left that goop in the bottom. Well, what that does is it makes the paint really thin and runny, and it's glossy. And I think it just doesn't really work right. So it turns out you got to stir that crap up. The first time that I really wanted to stir this stuff up, I gave it a good effort, and eventually I determined I must have had a bad can of paint. So I went and bought a second can of paint locally. That one was the same way. So then I just figured I had 2 bad cans of paint. I ordered 2 more cans of paint from 2 different sources. So at that point I got 4 cans of paint. All 4 are like that. The last 2 that I got were not quite as bad, but they still had a big old pile of solids in the bottom. And I actually emailed these guys and told them, I was like, hey, I'm getting all this defective paint. What am I supposed to do? And their answer was, keep stirring until it dissolves. And I was like, okay, pretty sure that's wrong, but, let's just keep stirring until it dissolves. Well, it turns out it will dissolve, but you got to stir this crap. It took me about 10 minutes, maybe even 15 minutes the first time, the ones that were really bad, to finally get all of that stuff in solution. So I ended up like taking my paint stick, and I'm using a piece of metal as a paint stick, and just jamming it in there and digging and poking and stirring and dragging this across the top of the solids as I was stirring, just trying to break that stuff up. And then once it kind of breaks up, you're just constantly stirring, trying to get it to dissolve in solution. Pain in the butt, but it turns out that's really important. The color's off if you don't do that. The durability's not there. It paints differently. So that's actually important. Alright, so that's a big deal. So another big mistake, do not paint with the cap off. It says not to do that, but I was like, oh, you can probably get away with that. Turns out you cannot. I did it one time. I put the cap back on, or put the lid on. Next time I opened it, there was a rock hard layer of paint on the top. So don't do that. So what I do is I just have like a plastic painter's cup. These things are $1 or something. They're not expensive. And I just pour the paint into that. Easy solution. And then if I'm not using it, I just cover it up with foil so the paint doesn't, because I'm, like right now I'm waiting on this to dry, and I'm going to flip them to the other side. So just keep it covered. So paintbrush, I'm using cheap paintbrushes. I just wrap them up in a bag. It only works for a few hours, and then you gotta throw them away. So I use cheap brushes. I guess if you're trying to get a perfect finish, maybe on the last coat use a better brush. I use like I say cheap. they're like middle of the road. So they make like, you know, good, better, best, or whatever. These are like the cheap ones and the mid grades, something like that. They work. You don't have to have the best brush, in my opinion. But okay. So now let's go over preparation before you paint, because I think I found something on this too. So here's some parts I did. This is two good examples. This piece, I was painting it with Por 15, but I did not mix up those solids like I was talking about. So if we zoom in, see this roughness? This paint like didn't really flatten out. It just like mirrors what's underneath the metal. If you can see that. See all the lines and stuff? That's like the shape of the metal. All those grooves. This paint is so thin. Now it's hard. I'm running my fingernail on it and like I'm not scratching it. But this paint is like super, super thin like this. And it was pretty runny as well. So this took, I believe, 2 coats of paint. And it's super glossy. The color's not right. That's because I didn't have those solids mixed in. Here's the next part. And if you show these two next to each other, it's kind of obvious. One's flat, one's gloss. These are from the same paint can. The difference was, this one I opened the can of paint, stirred it without getting the solids dissolved. The next time I actually dissolved the solids, and I got a totally different sheen. So this time, this paint is the actual correct color. And it looks a lot better, and it fills in a lot of, like if you zoom in here, the metal doesn't look as scratched and whatever. This stuff is like a lot thicker. So it hides, you know, some of the surface imperfections when you paint this stuff on. Now this one, I did a better job of painting, but I still put this stuff on too thick. So like if you come over here, there's paint runs. Now this thing's kind of dusty, but you can see there's paint runs in this as well. And I was putting it on fairly thin, but I'll be honest, I wanted a good finish. So I was trying to get like a medium coat. In my opinion, that's a mistake, and I'm a fan of putting paint on medium and thick. But it doesn't really work with this stuff. You end up with paint runs. This part's got paint runs all over it, despite me trying not to get paint runs in it. So, and all these parts, like I think the paint sticks. These were all cleaned with like a wire wheel to get all the rust off. I got pretty much all the rust off of these with a wire wheel and a drill. And then I took acetone and white rags and just kept running acetone and white rags until the rags come back clean. And that takes a little bit of time, maybe like half an hour to 45 minutes. But metal was super clean. Okay, so let me show you what I did on these last parts. So this is where we really step things up to get the best finish. And this is what I'm going to recommend if you have the ability. So these are some control arms that I wanted to paint. These are the ones I'm doing now. Let me show you the ones I did a few weeks ago before I show you the latest ones. So these, I basically took a wire wheel, clean, you know, obviously get all the grease and dirt off with rags, took a wire wheel, get all the rust off, and then brushed it on like thin to medium. Let's see. They're not bad. You can see here some of this defects are not really covered up, but I put this on pretty thin. So it's really not bad. This wasn't bad, but some of this is just what was, the material was in this condition. So basically the paint shows what the surface looked like. So it's really not bad. I think this is going to stick good. I might see if I can leave my fingernail mark. Not really, no. That's pretty hard paint. So these were pretty good. And this is just, you know, the clean them, wire wheel, then run over them with acetone and white rags, and then I masked off the stuff I didn't want paint on, brushed it on. This is 2 coats. I believe it's 2 coats. Yeah, these were 2 coats. I did 1 coat, hoping, I tried to do these in 1 coat and it didn't work. I had to put a 2nd coat. So that's how those worked. This is an acceptable method in my opinion. Overall, pretty happy, but there is a better way to do it. Okay, so let's talk about the best way to do it. The best way that I've found. So these are the same things, control arms for the same vehicle. They're in the same condition as the front ones, but here's the difference. I sandblasted these before I painted them. So this paint's not done drying yet. Let's see if I can get focus. But the surface is a little bit more uniform. Now the paint, the sheen's a little off. This isn't done drying yet. But this is 2 coats on the top. I haven't flipped it and done the other side yet. But this gave a little bit more of a uniform surface. Like if I get down here in the welds, I don't know if the light makes that look weird, but Yeah, these definitely turned out better. Just a more uniform finish. And the more uniformity, I think, is just from blasting them. But I got a feeling that's going to help with adhesion as well, you know, because like the ones over there, there was still some original paint that was, I didn't wire brush all the paint off, I just got all the rust off. Well, that's what I thought. Now, when I did these, there were areas of old paint that looked fine, but when I blasted it, there was actually rust under that paint. So this is a better quality job because I got it down to bare metal before I painted it. So that rust, even though it was invisible, it was still there. Okay. So I get them out of the blast cabinet. I take like an air gun, get rid of all the dust to, you know, get rid of all the abrasive particles that get in these things. Now the last step before painting was I took one of these little torches. You can pick these up at like Lowe's or Home Depot or something. They're pretty cheap. They're like 20 bucks or something. And you just screw this onto the top, pull the trigger. It gives you a little bit of flame. And what happens is, if you've never seen this, look it up on YouTube. But if you run like a flame over a piece of metal, you'll see it like change color and like you'll see this thing growing and spreading out. It's some kind of outgassing, getting rid of like oils or water or something. Something that's in the metal goes away when you hit it with a flame. So basically just running heat over these parts gets rid of that. I think they call it like degassing or outgassing or something. But it does that, it gets rid of whatever's on the surface of the metal and it heats the parts up a little bit. So you kind of get two benefits. You get rid of whatever contamination was in the metal, but you also heat them up a little bit, which probably helps the paint. Okay. And then I guess one of the last things I'll mention is I actually painted these indoors. I'm in a shop right now, so that's able to keep all the dust down. And then I took my paint, you know, using all the best practices I've learned, stirred this stuff for probably 10 minutes. Basically, I stirred it until I was sure that I didn't need to stir it anymore. And I stirred it for about 5 more minutes because I just wanted to be sure. And I've noticed that even when you do that, you pour this stuff in here, if you start painting for say 30 minutes, that's a mistake. Only paint for like 10 minutes and then grab your paint stick and sure enough, it's already trying to settle into the bottom of the can. So you got to keep this stuff mixed, even while you're painting. But what I did was I took a brush, and I came over here, and I just put it on too thin. That's what I did. So if you've ever like primed something, sometimes with primer, you take your brush and you're just like digging it into the material, like real thin and just pushing and trying to get that paint. You're not just laying a layer of paint on top, you're trying to get it to work in. It's like if I go to like this area, like see like up under those cracks and stuff, I actually missed a spot. But I tried really hard to like jam the brush in there and, you know, get full coverage. So I did that on these parts and just kept on working it in really thin. It looks like hell. Like they don't look like this, you know. It's a thin coat. Well, actually the bottom looks like what I'm talking about. Yeah, here's the bottom. This is one coat. You can see all the marks, the lines. You can actually see metal. It's definitely thin. Looks like hell. But that's okay. I got that first coat on, and then look what happens when you put the second coat on. All of a sudden, you get good looking parts. And this coat is so thin that I think for the first time ever, I don't have paint runs. The only paint runs that I found on this, if you look on here, when I did my first coat, this was like another learning thing, but I had the part like this laying on the paper, and I jammed the brush like this, which naturally caused paint to just puddle between the paper and this, and that did leave some thick paint runs on the part. So I guess watch out for that. My advice would be to take the parts like this, prop them up, and then that way none of the edges are touching anything, and just work your way halfway and stop. Let it dry, flip them over, do the other side. But this stuff's pretty forgiving as far as like you could paint stuff on one day and come back the next day and flip them and do the other side, or wait a couple hours and flip them, do the other side. And it works pretty nice. So hope you guys found this helpful. I watched some videos myself before I started using this, and I was basically about to give up with this stuff because it seemed like, you know, I just couldn't get the results I wanted. And I just kept trying stuff, and I finally seem to have found something that works for me. So, hope this helps you guys out, and till next time, y'all take it easy. Alright, so here's a little bit of bonus footage. So, this is a control arm that already has a single coat, but you can tell it's pretty thin, and there's marks and not runs, but it's just thin spots. It doesn't look very good. So that's a thin coat. Now I'm going to put a second thin coat, and I want you to see what this does, how big a difference it makes. And again, this is with the POR 15 paint we were talking about. So what I do is I just barely I've dipped the paintbrush, I kind of wiped off the excess, and I'm just very thin going to brush on a second coat. And I'm working that paint into the surface, trying not to get it too thick. I don't want any paint runs at all. And watch what happens. Notice I haven't put any paint back on the brush yet. Okay, so we just did all that with a single, and I just put this little bit of paint on the brush here, knocked some of that excess off, and then we're back to it. A little bit more, knocking off some of that excess. A little bit goes a long way. Seems like you'd have to put it on thick for this to work, but you really don't. So like back here, you can see I pick up from underneath and roll forward, keeping it thin, don't need any paint runs. Some of these areas like this where there's welds and there's hole features, poking the brush, trying to get full coverage, and then I'll just run over it like that real quick at the end to get an even finish. Like we said, putting it on thin, but that seems to work. Might be a little too thin there, but there we go. Okay, so that's after putting that thin coat. So over here, this has one thin coat of paint. Here's the one after the second coat. As you can see, way more uniform surface finish. Let's see if I can get like a good side-by-side comparison. Yeah, that kind of shows up pretty good. You can see all the runs and streak, or not runs, but just like all the marks left behind putting a thin coat on the first one. It just disappears with that second coat. So, pretty awesome. I guess if you put it on thicker, maybe it would lay down a little bit flatter. I'm sure if you sanded between coats, you could get a better finish. These are just suspension parts, so this is plenty good enough. But yeah, this system definitely works. I highly recommend it. All right, guys, take it easy.